As the G20 summit gets underway in Japan on Friday, all eyes will be on the bilateral meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump. And while some predict a truce to the ongoing trade war, mixed signals from the U.S. mean nobody can be sure. In an interview on Wednesday, President Donald Trump said he's planning to impose additional tariffs on Chinese exports if talks fail to yield a constructive outcome. And these remarks followed the latest move by the U.S. to blacklist 5 Chinese supercomputer organizations, once again citing, quote, national security. Considering this, should we really expect the talks to resolve the current deadlock? And how will Japan, as the host, mediate between China and the U.S.? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Qiuyuan, sitting in for Liu Xin. Joining me from Boston is Dr. Jim Walsh, a senior research associate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Security Studies program. And here in the studio in Beijing with me is Professor Liu Baocheng at the University of International Business and Economics. Great to see you both. Welcome. Let me start with Dr. Walsh. Now, we've been seeing mixed signals coming from Washington in the lead up to this high-stake meeting. In his interview with Fox Business Network on Wednesday, Trump said substantial additional U.S. tariffs would be placed on goods from China if no progress on a trade deal is made with President Xi Jinping. And he said, quote, I'm quoting his words, "My plan B with China is to take in billions and billions of dollars a month, and we will do less and less business with them." Well, how seriously should we take these comments by President Donald Trump?
Well, after more than 2 years now, I think there's a pretty strong track record that the president often has very strong rhetoric and says strong things, and sometimes those actions follow, and sometimes they don't. So I wouldn't put too much stock in any one particular statement. I mean, in Iran this week, the president, said all sorts of things in all sorts of different directions. He said he was going to obliterate Iran, and he talked about, no, he only wanted to act proportionally. So I don't know that the statements are as indicative as the behavior. But I would guess, based, as you have suggested, there's some early media reporting that hints at a fact that there might be a truce, a pause in the ever-growing number of tariffs that are being imposed on all the parties. I think that's the best possible outcome. I think that would be a good outcome, but I would hold my breath because I don't think anything is set in stone yet.
A temporary truce might be a good outcome, but President Trump has also commented saying that my plan B is maybe my plan A, saying that my plan B is that if we don't make a deal, I will tariff, and maybe not at 25%, but maybe at 10%. That's his words. I don't think that's a plan B. That's just what comes after talks break down. But Professor Liu, what are we supposed to read from these conflicting statements?
Well, that's his style of negotiation, to come to negotiate with tease and with threat so that the other would really feel jitter. And when the other is really being confused, and they may decide to backtrack on the bottom line they set. But this is not really the way to deal with China, because one is that Chinese leaders, they are pretty much unified, and they have very clearly defined principles as how negotiation can proceed, and they have a clear understanding what are those causes behind it, which China doesn't really unilaterally bear the blame. So without the right type of respect, without the type of reciprocity, in negotiation, simply by browbeating, bullying the other to capitulate, and I think he is really underestimated the firmness of the Chinese negotiator and Chinese leader, but in the meantime, he also underestimated the resilience the Chinese economy can play, even the China and the U.S. trade is being diminished.
And how much of this posturing, being tough on China, is Trump playing to his base ahead of next year's election, Dr. Walsh?
Well, of course, it's hard to know his intentions, but that would be consistent with his behavior in other areas. He's all about pleasing the base. The trade war with China and immigration, I think, are 2 of his most important issues to that base that has been successful for him. And so certainly if not driven by domestic politics, it's certainly a big factor. And as you know, the president recently kicked off his re-election campaign, and we had presidential debates last night. And so I think that sort of thing will grow more intense over time as the election calendar continues. But, you know, I think the core issue here, you can ask yourself, well, how much of this is tactics and strategy on Trump's part? I personally think it's just personality and psychology, not policy. I think this is just the way he is. This is the way he operates. He operates this way on every issue, whether it's China or something else entirely. So it's really more of a style of personality and a mindset rather than some sort of devious set of negotiating tactics.
But Professor Liu, isn't that true that it's ultimately going to be his voters who are going to be hurt by this? I mean, business sales are going to take a hit. Their jobs might possibly on the line. Their living costs might go up if the tariffs takes place. Isn't that true that they're going to ultimately pay the price?
Well, the reason that his constituency supported him because they do feel the problem, the loss of job, the loss of decent job, and the shanty houses that needs to repair the roof, etc. But do they really place the right bet on the right move? So that's another big question. So he made beautiful promises to those people. I'm going to bring jobs back. I'm going to reindustrialize the nation so that everyone can be happy. But now, you know, after almost 2 years, what has been delivered? And the Holland Tunnel is still under repaired. And all the infrastructures have not really been taking place, although with all the promises, and also all those farmers. So right now he is really paying a compensation to subsidize those farmers due to the result of the trade war, but that doesn't give people hope. That doesn't give people a basic calculation of what they can do next year whatsoever. So now people do feel the pain because consumers are paying higher prices and farmers have difficulty to export their stuff, and even multinational companies that are situated in America, they are blocked doing business with their regular partner like Huawei, etc. So, you know, fantasy is now being displaced by reality. So I think this trend is going to develop further.
Now, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin remarked on Wednesday in an interview with CNBC saying that the U.S. and China were close to a trade deal. He said, quote, "We were about 90% of the way there," and he thinks there's a path to complete this. Dr. Walsh, do you share his view that a deal is within reach, and what is this final 10% that needs to be negotiated?
Well, I assume in principle a deal should be possible. You know, there's an old saying in diplomacy, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And if you're 90% the way there, odds are that last 10% is the toughest part of the 100%, right? You know, that's why it gets left to the end, because it's hard. So I would not take that as strongly indicating that something will happen. It's sort of par for the course. And I'd like to respectfully disagree a little bit with my colleague back in Beijing. I mean, he's right to point to the fact that the trade war has had an economic impact on the U.S. economy, and the Federal Trade Reserve, you know, at the aggregate level, the federal chairman of the Federal Reserve is talking about cutting interest rates, switching positions, in part because of fears for the U.S. economy. But right now, and for the last 2 years, the economy has been going gangbusters. It has, you know, unemployment's low, et cetera, et cetera. And so some people may not be doing well, farmers. Other people are probably doing quite well. And so that gives the president some leeway. It gives him some leverage. And so on the one hand, he has political challenges, but I think the U.S. economy is probably stronger than China's economy today. And then it's a question of, you know, who can take the punches. Will a softening global economy because of this trade war hurt China sufficiently that it is more motivated to get something done? Or will the president be more motivated to get something done? But it's not entirely clear who is suffering more. I think all the parties are suffering. The suffering will increase rather than decrease. But the U.S. economy right now is sort of bailing the president out because, you know, the stock market keeps rising, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a bit of an advantage for him in these negotiations.
Professor Liu, you want to respond to that?
Yes. Well, I believe that the U.S. economy is temporarily doing good in terms of the three prime indicators: employment, inflation, and the GDP growth. But the first question is that can the existing cabinet led by Donald Trump take the full credit? Is it something that is really developed in the growth cycle? That's one question. The other is that as the two biggest economies, United States and China, what type of a responsible example they are going to place, you know, when they really adopt a zero-sum type of game, you know, punching the other and see who is going to first fall. So right now at the G20, you know, when the world finally managed to a basic recovery, and when two elephants are fighting in a zoo, so you know, how would other, you know, monkeys and other animals would really look at this drama? And then can that also further push the other members to get more united in terms of more a tightened trade agreement that can shun the United States? So is the current existing appearance of prosperity doesn't really give him the right type of credit in actuality through basic economic analysis, and also the prospect may not really warrant a sustainable prosperity.
And sounds like we're going to see something very interesting at the G20 summit. But meantime, the U.S. Commerce Department last week blacklisted 5 Chinese supercomputing organizations, as we mentioned earlier, saying they pose a threat to national security, cutting them off from crucial American technology. Dr. Walsh, I want to get your take on this. Why is the U.S. targeting China's supercomputing organizations after banning Huawei?
Well, I think this is a sort of a longer story than the trade story. And it's, you know, obviously economics gets mixed in, but it's closer to being a national security issue than it is a pure trade and economic issue. So there's concern in the U.S. That state-supported businesses in China, particularly in high technology, which has applications to national defense, or that may in the future, you know, in a 5G world, could shape access to information, that those are national security issues. And people are worried in the U.S. about the close ties between, I mean, China is a communist state, right? So people are worried about the ties between the government and particular corporations who have subsidized those, you know, who have been subsidized by the government, and who people fear might be involved with those corporations. So it is a more complex, believe it or not, it's even more complex than trade.
And just how should we look at this coming just days before Xi and Trump's meeting? Dr. Walsh.
Yeah, you know, again, I would not look for some master thread that ties all this together. I think a lot of this is happenstance and randomness. You know, the government, U.S. government for its part, I mean, commerce is pretty well staffed, but there are other parts of the U.S. government that, you know, have empty chairs sitting in it because senior officials haven't been appointed. So I wouldn't read too much into the timing of things, but I want to comment on what my colleague said, and I agree with him. You know, the G20, one of the things that could happen, you know, President Trump doesn't like these meetings. He doesn't like being with a bunch of other leaders. He likes being, you know, the only leader at a meeting, or this, you know, being hosted by another leader. So he doesn't like these group meetings to begin with. On the plane ride over, he's already tweeting, you know, threats to Europe over trade, to India over trade. So he's going to enter this meeting, and, you know, most of the people in the meeting are going to be worried. They're going to be worried about a war with Iran, which could hurt the global economy, and they're going to be worried about, you know, the economy being hurt by tariffs. So it definitely, the president is sort of pushing everyone else together because of his very aggressive stance. But will that change his behavior? Sometimes he just reacts to that, you know, very strongly. Now, as for the economy, the president, I doubt the president is responsible for the economy, the good economy. I don't think, unless you screw it up really badly, most presidents, these are things that don't happen every 4 years. The economy has its own rhythm. So I doubt Trump gets the credit for it technically, but as any good politician, Democrat or Republican would do, he's going to take credit for it, and he will get credit for it, whether he deserves it or not. So as a political matter, it's all sort of the same thing anyway.
He's going to seize on it, isn't he? All right, we're going to leave it there. We're running out of time. Thank you so much, Professor Liu Baocheng at University of International Business and Dr. Jim Walsh from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Joining me after the break when we'll be asking how important are the talks in maintaining economic growth for both China and the U.S. You're now watching The Point. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Point. For more analysis on the impending meeting between President Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, joining me from Washington to discuss the economic implications of the trade talks taking place there in Japan is Professor Christopher Chambers, Professor of Media Studies, Georgetown University, and here in Beijing studio, Professor Zhao Hai, a research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Good to have both of you with us. Now, let me start with Professor Chambers first. Now, in response to President Trump's claim that additional tariff will be imposed on Chinese exports if no deal can be made, Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs responded that the U.S. threat will not scare the Chinese people. We have a soundbite to play. Let's play that soundbite and get your response afterwards. Let's take a listen.
China has always advocated resolving Sino-U.S. trade disputes through dialogue. But at the same time, we will firmly defend our legitimate rights and interests. The U.S. threat to impose additional tariffs on China will not scare the Chinese people. I hope the U.S. side will listen to the people and various groups at home who oppose the trade war and tariffs. During the G20 summit, they should also listen to the international community's opposition to unilateralism, protectionism, and bullying.
So there you have it, the spokesperson saying that China would not bow to pressure. And now, given the two sides seem so far apart, what kind of timeline are we looking at for a resolution, assuming this weekend's talks goes well?
Well, the only timeline that the president and his allies care about are the elections in 2020. Basically, what they will try to do is forestall any negative impact on the economy until after that November, while ratcheting up the rhetoric against the Chinese as an enemy and keeping in place as many of the subsidies that they can to basically buy off a lot of the people, including the bigger factory farmers, as we call them, not the smaller family farms, but the bigger factory producers in industries like that. So I think that that's what what he's looking to, is to forestall any negative effects, and that includes, say, the European Union coming in on China's side, because the European Union has a big voice, especially in Germany, as to the negative effects of these tariffs.
Now, China's chief negotiator and Vice Premier Liu He said last month there are currently three main points of contention between the two sides. First of all, the U.S. must remove all the additional tariffs imposed on China. Second, the targets set by U.S. for Chinese purchases should be in line with real demand. And third, the text of a deal should be, quote, balanced to ensure the dignity of both nations. Professor Zhao, how far are the two sides away from resolving these differences?
I think in many ways we're still very far apart in terms of both sides' standings on these issues. However, there's still room to discuss these issues and try to find a common ground. For instance, the U.S. probably won't just cancel all the added tariffs at this point. They want to keep the tariffs as a negotiation tool to keep pressure on China. However, they're willing to probably stop the further adding of tariffs for another $300 billion and probably talking about reducing already added tariffs if the current negotiation goes well. And secondly, I think in terms of purchase, I believe both sides can find a middle ground in terms of realistic purchase from the Chinese side. And I think many in the U.S. also oppose the idea that the Chinese state should play a major role in purchasing everything from the United States. However, I think the third point is very much difficult because the Chinese side really wanted a balanced text. And at this point, the U.S. wanted to have some kind of a legal mechanism, so-called implementation mechanism, that is very intrusive and irrespectful in many ways. So I think that's the area the negotiators need to put more time on.
Those are the major sticking points, aren't they? Now, let's also look at the influence of the trade war on the economy. First, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and major banks such as Morgan Stanley recently lowered their growth forecast for China, citing trade concerns. World Bank predicted earlier this year that China's GDP growth will deaccelerate from 6.6% in 2018 to 6.2% in 2019. The IMF lowered its 2019 growth forecast for China to 6.2% from 6.3% last Wednesday. Professor Chamber, how reliable are these predictions, are these figures? Do you share this negativity or pessimism?
Well, I think they're being guarded on purpose, and because they have to be. Given the unpredictability of the administration here in Washington. I don't have any specific issues that I can point to with their figures. They come up with this on their own. I think that it might be a good, not necessarily a positive for the president, but in a strange way, a good wake-up call to China to basically prepare itself for what could come if the president is not mollified, if the president does not get what he perceives he wants. In a way, it's almost a way of toughening up to await the fight and go into the fight with both eyes open, as we say. I mean, we don't, I teach my son to box, and I say you don't close your eyes or get too overconfident. You got to be able to take the punch. And I think that this might be, in a strange way, a positive thing for China to be able to prepare itself for the punch, because if the punch comes and it doesn't land, then China can counterpunch very effectively. So I don't see this necessarily as a negative for China with the World Bank has their figures.
And what about the impact on American businesses, Professor Chamber? A recent survey by American Chambers of Commerce in China showed that the negative impact of tariffs is clear and hurting the competitiveness of American companies. The vast majority of respondents say the increases in U.S. and Chinese tariffs are having a negative impact on their businesses. How do you evaluate the loss?
Well, there are two things going on here. I mean, first are the business metrics of what's going on in the United States. There are a lot of potential problems. A lot of real problems have occurred already, but then there's also the potential for even worse things to come. I think what we have to understand is there's no protectionism in this policy. The president isn't protecting anything. The president is attacking China as a convenient target and as a way of mollifying a base of people whose industries through the business cycle have been on the wane, and rather than retrain and move into other industries, he would much rather pander to some sense of loss of something that's not coming back. So you have that going on as well. So you have all these different factors floating here, but from the business metrics point of view, yes, I mean, we're suffering now. We will suffer. Our people are going to basically be paying another tax because of these tariffs. So, we'll see how all this plays out.
And Professor Zhao, your takes on the long-term economic implication if a deal cannot be reached? What can China and the U.S. do to keep their respective economies in robust health if progress fails to materialize?
I think the economy has its own rhythm, inner rhythm, and at a certain point, the U.S. economy, which has been stretching a very long economic growth for almost more than 10 years now, bound to get into some kind of decline or recession. So I think that's natural, and also China's economy has been very strong and recently slowed down, and probably there was some weakness not only in China but globally. So in that respect, it's natural law of economics. However, for President Trump, because of his unpredictability and also because he launched this war of tariff between the two countries, it put extra pressure on the U.S. economy. So if there's no deal, he would definitely pressure the Fed to pump up more money into the system and have a superficial economy going further. However, that's going to harm the U.S. in the long run. For China, I think if there's no deal, China will develop a regional and push more for regional economic free trade deal, and also open up more, attracting more foreign investment, at the same time maintaining good relations with many other countries other than the U.S., maintaining China's own growth. And also China has policies stimulating domestic innovation. So I think combine all those policies with tax cut also in China, China's economy can be expected to maintain the growth rate, current growth rate.
And we know that, Professor Zhao, China has lower tariffs on goods from other countries to try to counter the actions of the U.S. What else can China do to redress the balance?
I think China's overall tariff weighted is already lowered to just more than 4% overall. So I think in that respect, China has shouldered more international responsibility and meet the requirement of the WTO. What China can further do, particularly at this G20 meeting, is to have more relations, good relations with Japan, India, and European countries to form a coalition that uphold free trade, international free trade, giving more pressure to the U.S. from taking more actions on tariff and racking the current international supply chain.
And Professor Chamber, what about the U.S. side? Have the U.S. taken any similar step? Is this type of action a viable long-term solution for the two countries?
Well, I think the long-term solution is in bilateral talks between China and the United States trying to resolve this. I think that everybody else in the world is looking at, especially the European Union, is looking at this. Right now, we're almost isolated ourselves. I mean, we've isolated ourselves essentially. And so we really, it's really going to depend on what the president can do bilaterally this week. If there's no agreement or even a hope for an agreement, I think the United States economy is going to be in trouble long term.
All eyes will be watching this, isn't it? All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much, Professor Christopher Chambers, Professor of Media Studies, Georgetown University, and here in Beijing studio, Professor Zhao Hai from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And that's all from this edition of The Point. As always, follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Liu Xin. Download the CGTN app to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thank you for watching. You've got The Point.